Question number 8, Joanne Hayes.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Education. What recent announcements has she made about funding to support students at risk of educational underachievement?
The Honourable Heke Parata.
Mr Speaker, this morning I announced that almost every state and state integrated school and kura will receive a share of an extra $12.3 million to support students most at risk of underachieving. This extra funding represents a 1% increase to the operations grant funding, taking it to a total of $1.35 billion for 2017, which demonstrates that despite what the unions and the opposition have been saying, there is no funding freeze for education. The increased money is being targeted to those students most at risk of underachievement. These are students from families on long-term welfare. We have identified around 133,000 students who qualify under this criteria. Schools were notified yesterday of the exact amount they will be receiving in the targeted funding.
Supplementary question, Joanne Hayes.
Thank you. How will this additional funding support the investment this government is already making in education?
The Honourable Heke Parata.
Mr Speaker, this government has a clear track record of increasing spending on education. Investment in education is up by 35% since 2008, and the early childhood education budget has more than doubled. With that increased funding comes the responsibility to ensure the money is being spent in the best possible way for all our children and young people to achieve. Our social investment approach is part of that, identifying and investing early in those who are most at risk of not being successful in education. Mr Speaker, the education sector has been asking for more funding for students at greatest risk, which is exactly what we're doing with the targeted funding. This extra funding is a clear example of how our funding system could be improved to get more support to those students who need it the most.
Supplementary question, Tracy Martin.
Can the Minister explain why her government has made a funding decision based on adult-focused markers, such as the educational achievement of the mother, rather than expanding screening tools and centrally collected school entry data to equity fund children on their identified actual needs, including those children who are gifted and talented?
The Honourable Heke Parata.
Mr Speaker, we have not done that.
Supplementary question, Tracy Martin.
How will her funding announcement assist those students whose families do not match her 4 external predictive markers, but still require additional assistance to achieve their academic best, such as those with dyslexia, dyspraxia, or on the autism spectrum?
The Honourable Heke Parata.
Mr Speaker, in Budget 2016, I announced that rather than there being a universal 1% increase across all schools, we would use one factor to target. That factor is to children who have spent 75% of the first 5 years of their life or 75% of the most recent 5 years of their life in long-term benefit-dependent households, and that is because the evidence is emphatic that that can lead to underachievement. In answer to the second question...
Order. Point of order, Tracy Martin.
Sir, my question was quite specific around those children who do not meet the 4 external markers.
Order. The question was far from specific. I'm in some difficulty because it was so long and lengthy I couldn't understand it. Can I invite the member to ask the question again? It would be easier if it was more concise, but the member has the opportunity.
Kia ora, Mr Speaker. How will her funding announcement assist those students whose families do not match her 4 external predictive markers but still require assistance, such as dyslexics, dyspraxics and those on the autism spectrum?
The Honourable Heke Parata.
Mr Speaker, as I answered into the primary question, the particular funded targeting amount that is to go to schools next year is but one part of $1.35 billion that will be shared out between schools in 2017. In addition, in Budget 2016, we announced $43 million for special education, including a further 550,000 hours for teacher aid support.
Supplementary question, Chris Hipkins.
Why does the increase in funding for schools amount to just under 1% when inflation is expected to be 1.5% over that period, meaning schools are facing a funding cut in real terms?
The Honourable Hiki Parata.
Mr Speaker, there is no funding cut. In the period from 2010 to 2015, CPI inflation amounted to about cumulatively to 9.6%. Over that time, this government has invested in ops grants at a rate of 15%.
Order. Point of order, Chris Hipkins.
I think the Minister might have misunderstood the question. I wasn't asking about the historical funding profile, but the future funding profile. The figures she used were the historic funding figures.
I listened to the question. I may well have misunderstood it as well, but the way I heard the question from the member, it's certainly been addressed by the Minister. Question number 9.